And what was C.J. Loney's legacy in terms of Baptist history? Because I seem to recall that he was involved somewhat in the modernist controversy that occurred at McMaster. Can you share a little bit about what that controversy was about, and who some of the figures were?
Yeah, McMaster had started as a divinity college, so a theological college, in the 1870s. And then William McMaster, who was probably in today's terms a billionaire, he was one of the first senators of Canada, one of the founders of the Canadian Bank of Imperial Commerce. He left a huge bequest to the school in the late 1880s, and when he died, they renamed it after him. And there had been a liberal arts school near Woodstock called the Canada Literary Institute, and they relocated all of that to Toronto. By the 19-teens, in the early part of the 20th century, so the first decade of the 20th century, a lot of schools in the northern United States and Canada were beginning to wrestle with theological liberalism. Really, there was a drift. Usually the drift first appeared in the Department of the Old Testament. And sure enough, a man named I.G. Matthews, who would eventually go on to teach at the University of Chicago, began to teach problematic views about the authorship of a number of the Old Testament books, questioning Mosaic authorship of the first 5 books of Moses, raising questions about Darwinian evolution, and so on. And there was a wee bit of a controversy about his teaching, and things seemed to have settled down. He left eventually in 1919, and things seemed to be fairly stable. And then in 1925, the professor of pastoral theology, a man named Gilmore, died suddenly, and the school appointed L.H. Marshall, Lawrence Henry Marshall, who was an Englishman, a very brilliant preacher. And I've read a fair amount of his correspondence, which is still housed in McMaster. And obviously a very winsome individual, very friendly individual, built a number of very close friendships here in Canada, which he kept even after he went back to England in the late 1920s. But theologically, he had problems in certain areas. He didn't believe in the historicity of Jonah. He wrestled with the whole issue of inerrancy and inspiration. He believed the ideas of Scripture were inspired, not verbal inspiration. He would have denied penal substitutionary atonement, so the nature of what Christ did on the cross for sinners. He wrestled with the resurrection of the body as well. So there are a number of key areas that he had problems with, and his appointment plunged the Baptist denomination in Ontario and Quebec into a huge controversy. At the one side of it would have been McMaster, located still in Toronto, with L.H. Marshall. And at the other side was the conservative element in the denomination, led by T.T. Shields, who was the pastor of Jarvis Street Baptist Church. And if you know the geographical distance between Jarvis and Gerrard, and where the old McMaster was, it's about 20 minutes walk. So it's really just down the road. And the struggle went on a number of levels. T.T. would preach against L.H. Marshall, name him from the pulpit, sometimes would be heckled from people who would come who wanted to defend Marshall. The university denounced T.T. He was actually a trustee, so this was a very internal brawl. Both of them produced pamphlets galore. T.T. had his a magazine called The Gospel Witness, which he founded in part to basically defend the gospel against what he saw as the liberalism of L.H. Marshall. And in the middle of all that, C.J. Loney really was a key lieutenant for T.T. Shields. He would have stood by Shields, both verbally from the pulpit here, and also would have gone around to do rallies. Sometimes they'd bus people out to places like Brantford, Tillsonburg, Delhi, where they'd have rallies. Sometimes C.J. Loney and T.T. would go to rallies organized by McMaster to heckle. There was one in Brantford where they nearly got arrested by the police, and They were turfed out because they were heckling. Finally, in 26 or 27, it's in the minute books, Stanley Avenue passed a resolution to no longer fund theological education at McMaster. And the woman who proposed the motion would have only been probably in her early 20s at the time, a woman named Lottie Inrig. And I knew Lottie because when I first came here at the age of 19, Lottie sat on the Stanley Avenue side, and I would pass her, this very old woman who I really paid little attention to. I was a typical late teen, early 20s. And I had no realization of how much I, coming into this building without any knowledge of the gospel, owed to this woman and others like her. It wasn't only CJ, it was the congregation would pass this resolution that they would cut off funding to McMaster until McMaster came back to a gospel position. And over the years, I've used that as a very important example of the way in which there are different versions of church history, usually the version that we know, the big names. So you study this controversy, it's T.T. Shields or C.J. Loney. But it's also these other men and women, like Lottie Inrig, who in her own way was faithful in moving this motion so that this place would be a lighthouse for the gospel for people like me and many others like me who found Christ here.
Well, that's a wonderful story. We don't have a lot of time. We're so thankful that you could share part of this story, not just your personal story, but something about the legacy of Stanley Avenue. Is there anything that you want to wish our congregation, Blessings Christian Church, that now includes some of the former members of this wonderful congregation? Any message you want to leave with
well,
us?
I'm personally thrilled that the Lord has led you here. The congregation of Stanley Avenue Baptist Church had challenges. Some of the demographics that happen in inner cities, etc. And it's thrilling to think that on this place that there is a solid gospel witness going forth. And I pray that God's richest blessing would be upon your congregation, upon the ministry here, and that you would be a lighthouse for Christ in this part of Hamilton.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Michael, for giving of your time to tell this story.
Thank you.